They always said, never trust a wild animal with your child. But when you live at the edge of Prescott National Forest, Arizona, boundaries blur in unexpected ways. For Sarah Miller, each morning began with a quiet test of faith. Would the day bring safety or risk, comfort, or another reminder that the wild is never far? It was a Saturday that could have belonged to any late spring. Sun glinting off dew-soaked grass, pines whispering with a warm breeze, the faint scent of last night's rain still clinging to the air. Sarah stood on the sagging porch of her cottage, watching her 6-year-old daughter Grace lay a patchwork quilt over the soft earth beside the weathered fence. Next to Grace was Eli, the neighbor's boy, a year older and twice as eager for mischief. Behind the children, pacing the edge of the fence like a ghost, was Rusty, the bobcat that made people in town uneasy, and Sarah's heart ache with both hope and worry. Rusty's golden eyes flickered in and out of the shade. Even now, 2 years after she'd nursed him back from the brink, he was never tame. His right ear had a deep nick, a scar from an old fight, and his gait, though steady, betrayed the injury that meant he could never return to the wild fully. The state said he was unreleasable. The world called him dangerous. For Sarah and Grace, he was something else, something in between. Sarah never let herself forget. Rusty was not a pet, no matter how many times he curled up near the back door on stormy nights. He was a presence, a silent sentinel, a line between wild and home. She kept her rules sharp. Fences up, doors closed, never leave the children alone. It was a dance between respect and longing, always a heartbeat from disaster or wonder. After her divorce last fall, the little house at the forest's edge felt even quieter. Some evenings, loneliness crept in with the dusk, so thick Sarah swore she could hear it breathing. Work at the Wildlife Rehab Center kept her busy, but it was Grace's laughter, light and full as a bird's, that kept Sarah from drifting too far into herself. Grace, with her wild curls and endless questions, had a way of seeing straight through the barriers adults built, and Rusty was no exception. She didn't fear him. She marveled at him, trusted him in ways that made Sarah's pulse race with both pride and dread. That morning, as Grace and Eli arranged their stuffed animals into an elaborate tea party, Sarah felt a rare, careful peace settle in her chest. She moved between the kitchen and the porch, slicing apples for the children, checking the sunblock on Grace's nose, glancing every few moments at Rusty's silent form by the back fence. When she caught him watching, their eyes met, and for a second, Sarah wondered what passed through that feline mind. Did he remember the fire? The day she found him, singed and trembling, sheltering a lost puppy beneath his body in the smoky remains of the forest? Or did he just see her as another part of the landscape, neither threat nor prey? "Mom, can we have juice?" Grace called out, her voice pulling Sarah from her thoughts. "Coming, sweetheart," Sarah replied. She stepped inside, just for a moment, just long enough to grab the juice from the fridge and rinse the stickiness from her hands. She heard the kids giggle, Eli's voice rising in mock protest as Grace assigned him the role of the Queen's Royal Guard. For a heartbeat, everything was perfectly, mundanely safe. The world can turn in the blink of an eye. Inside, Sarah's hand hovered over the glasses when a strange silence pressed in, a hush that didn't belong. Then, from outside, a low yowl cut through the morning. It was wild, guttural, a sound that twisted Sarah's stomach into ice. She dropped the glass. It shattered in the sink. Rushing back to the door, she scanned the yard. The quilt was empty. Stuffed animals lay scattered, and Eli stood frozen near the fence, his face ghost-pale, his mouth wide in a soundless scream. Beyond him, At the edge of the yard's shadow, Sarah saw a blur of tawny fur, rusty, shoulders bunched, muscles taut, his mouth gripping the back of Grace's shirt as he dragged her away from the tangled brush bordering the fence. For a split second, Sarah's brain refused the scene. Was this the moment every warning, every late-night doubt had predicted? The wild reclaiming what never belonged. But then she saw Grace's little legs kicking, the terror in her eyes, and behind where the quilt had been, coiled and gleaming in the sunlight, a rattlesnake, its rattle buzzing in angry protest, head raised to strike again. Rusty's tail lashed, his body a shield between the snake and the child. Sarah leapt off the porch, heart in her throat, every instinct to scream warring with the need not to startle the snake or the cat. Eli's wail rose up at last, sharp and shrill. Sarah gathered Grace into her arms the second Rusty released her, stumbling backward, cradling her daughter's trembling form. For an instant, she met Rusty's eyes again. This time there was no mystery, only pain. Blood welled at his front paw, just above the pad, where the snake had struck. Sarah's mind raced. Paramedics, animal control, vet. But her first words, when they came, were soft, almost prayerful, as she clung to her child and looked at the wild animal who had saved her. "Where do we draw the line?" she whispered, voice breaking. "How much trust is too much? And what happens when the wild is the only thing standing between you and loss?" It was a question she'd never stop asking. It was a question every parent, every soul, must answer for themselves. The backyard was chaos. The peaceful morning had shattered, replaced by a whirlwind of fear and adrenaline that left Sarah trembling, clutching Grace so tightly the girl whimpered into her shoulder. Sarah barely noticed. All she could see was Rusty, a streak of wild muscle and pain, now crouched low with his eyes half closed and saliva glistening at the corner of his mouth. The wound on his leg was already swelling, blood matting the fur where the rattlesnake's fangs had found him. The snake, meanwhile, slithered off into the underbrush, satisfied with the havoc it had caused. Eli was still crying by the fence, unable to process what he'd witnessed. Sarah's mind raced. In seconds, she checked Grace for bite marks, hands trembling as she felt her daughter's arms and legs, desperate for reassurance. Nothing, just grass stains and the scent of fear. Grace's breathing was shallow, and her eyes were wide, locked on Rusty. Eli's cries rose higher, sharp and panicked, and Sarah fought to keep her own voice steady. "Eli, honey, are you hurt?" Sarah called, scanning him for any sign of blood or swelling. He shook his head, but his eyes were glazed, his lips trembling as he tried to speak. "Grace, Rusty," he grabbed her. "The snake," Eli stammered, pointing shakily at the tangled weeds by the fence. Sarah pressed Grace's head against her chest, heart pounding. She took a shaky breath, forcing herself to think. She needed to get both kids inside, away from the yard, away from the brush and anything else that might strike. "Come here, Eli," she said, her voice softer now, the kind of voice she'd learned to use with wounded animals and scared children alike. She pulled him toward her, her free hand gently guiding him past the place where the snake had coiled. Only when they were safely inside did she allow herself a moment to collapse against the door, knees buckling as the enormity of what had happened washed over her. The children clung to her, Eli's small hand gripping her sleeve, Grace silent but shaking. Through the window, Rusty's figure was still, hunched and breathing hard. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Sarah wanted to scream, to cry, to demand answers from the universe. Instead, she reached for her phone, her fingers slick with sweat. Should she call an ambulance? Grace seemed unharmed, but what if she'd missed something? What if the shock masked a hidden wound? Sarah's training warred with her mother's intuition. Check for fang marks, check for swelling, check for pain. Her hands moved almost automatically. Grace was scared, but she wasn't bitten. Eli's cheeks were flushed with tears, but he too was unharmed. That's when she noticed Rusty. His breathing was ragged, his pupils dilated, and his powerful body shook with each exhale. His leg had begun to twitch. Panic surged in Sarah's chest. She knew the signs. Venom from a rattlesnake bite could kill a bobcat in hours if left untreated. She grabbed a kitchen towel, wrapping it around his leg as best she could. But Rusty snarled weakly, the pain too much even for him. Grace's voice was a whisper, but it cut through the fear. "Mom, is Rusty going to die?" Sarah swallowed hard. "I don't know, honey, but we have to help him." That was the choice. The crossroads she never saw coming. Call an ambulance for Grace, just in case, and risk leaving Rusty to die alone. Or trust that Grace was safe and get Rusty to the emergency vet before it was too late. Her heart felt torn in two, between her child and the wild animal who had risked his own life to save her. She called the pediatrician first, her voice trembling as she explained what had happened. The nurse listened, calm and efficient, and told her to watch for signs of shock or allergic reaction, but said that if Grace showed no bite marks and was alert, she would likely be fine. Sarah nearly wept with relief, but there was no time for it. Next, she called the vet. Dr. Lopez was on call, thank God. She promised to clear a room immediately and meet Sarah in town. "Bring him now, every minute counts," the vet urged. Sarah moved quickly, adrenaline guiding her every motion. She bundled Grace into the neighbor's arms. Mrs. Taylor, thank heaven, was home and had already run over, drawn by the noise. "Watch her, please. I have to get Rusty to the vet. Please," Sarah pleaded, her eyes full of panic and gratitude. Mrs. Taylor nodded, drawing Grace and Eli inside, her presence calm and reassuring. As Sarah gathered Rusty into a pet crate, her hands shook so badly she could barely fasten the latch. The bobcat, sensing her fear, made a noise deep in his throat, half snarl, half plea. It was a sound Sarah would never forget. She whispered apologies, promises, prayers, anything to keep herself moving. As she carried Rusty to the car, the neighbors watched from behind curtains, rumors already spinning through their minds. Sarah felt their judgment like a physical weight on her shoulders, but she forced herself not to look back. This was bigger than fear or gossip. This was about loyalty, about trust, about the line between the wild and the world she was trying to build for Grace. Inside the car, Sarah drove faster than she ever had, every mile to the vet stretching like an eternity. She kept her eyes on Rusty in the rearview mirror, watching for the rise and fall of his breath. "Hold on," she whispered. "Please, just hold on." For Sarah, the question kept ringing in her mind. Had she risked her daughter's life by trusting Rusty? Or had that trust been the only thing that saved Grace? As the town blurred by outside her window, Sarah knew she would never see the world the same way again. The wild wasn't just outside her door. It was inside her home, inside her heart. And now it demanded everything she had to give. And somewhere in that trembling, gasping silence, Sarah found a new kind of courage. The courage to risk, to love, to trust the wild, no matter the price. Sarah's hands still shook as she stood in the vet's parking lot, the sun now climbing higher, painting sharp lines across her anxious face. The world was all motion and blur. Car doors slamming, the low hum of traffic, the bobcat's cage vibrating with Rusty's shallow, ragged breaths. Inside, her heart ached with guilt. She couldn't shake the feeling she'd somehow failed them all. Grace, Rusty, even herself. When Dr. Lopez hurried out, her expression was all brisk professionalism, but her eyes softened when she saw the wild animal trembling in the crate. "Let's get him inside," she said, voice low and urgent. "You did the right thing, Sarah. Now let's see what we can do." Sarah helped carry Rusty through the back entrance, away from curious clients and prying eyes. The exam room was cool and sterile, flooded with bright light. As Dr. Lopez and her assistant moved swiftly, muzzling, sedating, starting an IV for antivenom, Sarah stood pressed against the wall, arms wrapped around herself as if to hold the world together. With Rusty in the hands of the professionals, all Sarah could do was wait. The minutes felt endless. Her mind kept circling back to the chaos, replaying every detail with merciless clarity. Grace's scream, Eli's terror, Rusty's desperate yowl. What if I'd never brought Rusty here? What if I'd left Grace alone for just one more minute? The doubts swarmed her, buzzing like angry bees. She fumbled for her phone, desperate to hear Grace's voice. Mrs. Taylor answered, her tone calm. "She's okay, Sarah. She's shaken, but she's coloring with Eli now. I gave her some juice, and I'm keeping a close eye. Don't worry, honey. You just focus on your cat." Sarah choked out a thank you, relief and shame mixing in her throat. She should have been there for Grace, but Rusty's life was now on the line because of a choice she'd made. She stared at her trembling hands. How many times had her own father warned her? Wild never means safe, Sarah. Not for you. Not for anyone you love. The memory washed over her, sharp and fresh. She remembered being Grace's age, running wild through the same pines, always feeling a little too brave, a little too invisible. Her dad had been the forest ranger then, his boots muddy and his voice gentle but unyielding. He loved animals, respected them, but the rules were carved in stone. Never turn your back. Never lose respect for the line between wild and home. Sarah's rebellion had been Rusty. When the wildfire swept through 2 years ago, she was the one who ignored orders to stay away. She'd found him then, smoke-blackened, injured, but alive. More shocking, he'd been shielding a lost puppy, growling at the flames as if daring them to come closer. She'd brought them both to the center, and while the puppy went to a new home, Rusty's injuries, his leg, his ear, meant he'd never return to the forest. Sarah had convinced the rehab board to let her keep him on their private property, promising never to treat him as a pet. She'd built fences, made safety plans, and thought she could control every risk. But the wild had its own rules. Today, she was reminded how fragile that balance was. A gentle knock at the door snapped her out of her thoughts. Dr. Lopez stepped in, wiping her hands. "He's stabilized for now. We gave him antivenom and fluids. He's tough, Sarah, but the next few hours will tell." Sarah nodded, grateful for the news, but still unable to breathe easy. "Will he make it?" she whispered. Dr. Lopez hesitated. "He's got a shot. Bobcats are resilient, but it was a strong bite. We'll keep him overnight, monitor closely. If you want to stay with him, you can." Sarah nodded, sinking into the offered chair beside Rusty's crate. The bobcat was unconscious, his breathing labored but steady. She reached through the bars, brushing his fur gently, silently apologizing for every mistake, every risk she'd ever taken. Back at home, Grace sat huddled on Mrs. Taylor's couch, her knees pulled to her chest. Eli hovered nearby, quieter than usual. The television murmured in the background, a cartoon forgotten. Grace's small voice broke the silence. "Mrs. Taylor, did Rusty get hurt because of me?" The older woman looked at her with kind, steady eyes. "No, honey. He got hurt because he was brave. He was protecting you. Sometimes animals know what to do before we do." Grace thought for a moment, chewing her lip. "Will he be okay?" "I hope so, sweetheart. Your mama will do everything she can, Mrs. Taylor promised. The question hung in the air, heavier than any blanket. Grace wanted to see Rusty, to hug him, but she was scared too. Scared that she'd been the reason he'd risked everything. She sat quietly, tracing circles on her jeans, the weight of the day pressing down on her small shoulders. As the afternoon faded, Sarah finally called home. Hearing Grace's voice, small, tired but safe, gave her the courage to make another impossible choice. She explained gently that Rusty needed the doctor's help, but that she'd be home soon. I love you, Gracie. We'll get through this, I promise. She hung up, heart heavy with the price of trust. There were no right answers, only love and risk and hope tangled together like the roots of the oldest pine. In the quiet of the exam room, Sarah whispered a vow. If Rusty survived, she would honor what he'd done, whatever the world said. The sun was setting when Mrs. Taylor tucked Grace into her own bed, promising Sarah would be back soon. Grace drifted into uneasy sleep, her dreams full of wild forests and brave, battered bobcats. Sarah stayed by Rusty's side as night crept in, her hand resting on the cool metal bars. In that hush, filled with beeping monitors and the steady breath of the wild at her side, she found a fragile peace. The line between safety and trust had never been clear, but tonight, she was willing to risk everything for both. Sarah stayed in the waiting room long after sunset, the sterile overhead lights humming, the chairs hard and too close together. Every so often, a tech or a nurse would pass through, murmuring soft updates. He's holding on, no worse, no better. And Sarah would nod, clutching her phone and feeling the ache of fatigue settle deep in her bones. The night outside pressed against the clinic's glass walls, full of distant traffic, the scent of pine and rain barely lingering, as if the wild itself was pacing just beyond reach. She kept replaying the day in her mind, the coiled snake, Rusty's frantic lunge, the confusion and fear. A dozen times, she wondered if things would be different if she'd stayed on the porch, if she'd never let Rusty near Grace, if she'd listened to her father's warnings. But each time she looked back, the moment twisted. Rusty wasn't just an unpredictable animal, he was the reason Grace was alive. Sarah's phone buzzed in her hand, a lifeline to the world she'd left behind at home. There were texts from Mrs. Taylor. Grace was asleep now, clutching her favorite stuffed fox, her breathing even and slow. There was even a quick video. Grace in her pajamas, holding up a drawing of Rusty with a bright red cape, scrawled letters above him. Superhero cat. For a moment, Sarah smiled, her heart cracking open with a painful, hopeful warmth. The next buzz was a call. She answered, expecting another check-in from Mrs. Taylor or maybe her boss from the rehab center. Instead, an unfamiliar voice spilled through the line, a reporter from the local paper. Someone had called in, she said, about a bobcat attack at Sarah's address, and would Sarah like to comment? Was it true she was keeping a wild animal at home with a child? Sarah felt her defenses surge. No, Rusty didn't attack anyone, her words caught. How do you explain to a stranger what happened in those breathless seconds? The difference between danger and salvation. Rusty saved my daughter from a rattlesnake. He's not a pet, but he's not a monster either. The reporter pressed for details, but Sarah clammed up, voice cold as stone. Write what you want, but you better get it right. He's a hero. She hung up before she could be coaxed or cornered. Alone again, Sarah's mind drifted, spiraling back through old memories. Nights as a girl when coyotes howled outside her window, when she'd bury herself in her father's flannel shirts, listening for his boots on the porch. One evening, she'd wandered too far into the woods, and hadn't realized a coyote pack was nearby until her dad's shepherd, Max, came barreling from the brush, teeth bared, driving the wild animals off. He'd slept beside her bed for a week afterward, ears twitching at every sound. That mix of fear and gratitude, the knowledge that love was sometimes teeth and claws and standing between worlds. She knew it too well. As she sat lost in thought, the clinic's sliding doors whirred open and closed, letting in a draft of cool, pine-scented air. Sarah watched the receptionist glance over and whisper to another staff member. It wouldn't be long, she realized, before the story grew legs, neighbors whispering, news headlines twisting the truth. Could she keep Rusty? Would the town demand he be taken away, painted as a threat instead of a guardian? The anxiety sat heavy on her chest. Meanwhile, miles away, Grace couldn't sleep. She crawled from her bed and padded quietly into the living room, where the hush was only broken by the old wall clock and the gentle snoring of Mrs. Taylor in an armchair. On the kitchen table, Grace found her colored pencils and another sheet of paper. She drew Rusty's sharp green eyes, his battered ear, his big, brave heart. She drew him standing tall, with a golden sun behind him and a fence in the distance. Underneath, in crooked letters, she wrote, "Rusty is my family." She carried the picture to Rusty's empty crate, left it folded on the soft blanket inside, and whispered, "Come home, please." Back at the clinic, Sarah heard the low, uneven breathing from Rusty's room, a reminder that wildness can't be tamed, but sometimes it can be trusted. She remembered every time Rusty had watched over Grace, every stormy night he'd lingered by the door, every time he'd chased off the coyotes that haunted the edge of their property. Each memory made the line between wild and family blur a little more. Suddenly, the waiting room's quiet broke. A young woman entered, phone in hand, eyes wide and eager. She spotted Sarah and hurried over. "Are you Sarah Miller? The one with the Bobcat?" Before Sarah could answer, the woman continued, "My little brother lives down the street. He says that cat scared off a coyote a few weeks back. I just wanted to say, not everyone's scared of him. Some of us think he's pretty amazing." Sarah managed a tired, grateful smile. "Thank you. That means more than you know." As midnight crept closer, Dr. Lopez came out again. "He's stable. He'll make it through the night," she said, her voice both gentle and certain. Relief flooded Sarah so suddenly she almost wept. She asked to see Rusty and was allowed into the small recovery room. Rusty, groggy and bandaged, lay curled on his side, his breathing less labored. Sarah knelt beside him, fingers brushing his fur through the bars. "You did good," she whispered. "Rest now. We'll face whatever comes together." Outside, the wild was silent. But inside, a mother, a daughter, and a battered bobcat were all learning the same lesson. Sometimes, love means standing on the edge of fear and choosing to trust anyway. The hours between midnight and dawn stretched on forever. Sarah sat upright in the clinic chair, her back aching, and her mind whirling with fear and fatigue. Every so often, she drifted into a light, haunted sleep, jolted awake by the creak of the door or the distant bark of a dog in the parking lot. The world felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for a verdict that would decide not just Rusty's fate, but the shape of her entire family. When the phone finally rang, Sarah snatched it up with a shaking hand. It was her ex-husband, Mark. His voice was sharp and brittle, full of judgment. "Sarah, what the hell happened? I got a call from Eli's parents. They said there was an attack at your house." "That damn cat," Sarah interrupted. her tone cold and defensive. Rusty saved Grace's life. It was a rattlesnake, not him. He's fighting for his life right now. Mark's frustration burst through the receiver. This is insane. You're not just risking your job, Sarah. You're risking our daughter. What's the board at the center going to say? What will the neighbors do now? Sarah gripped the phone tighter, feeling the unfairness like a stone in her gut. You're not here, Mark. You didn't see what happened. Rusty isn't just some wild animal. He's part of this family, whether you like it or not. He sighed heavily, falling into a weary silence. I just want Grace safe. That's all I've ever wanted. His words lingered, heavy and unresolved, before the line went dead. Sarah's pulse thundered in her ears. She wanted to scream, to break something, but all she could do was sit in that sterile room, hands folded and eyes burning with exhaustion and anger. Not long after, her phone buzzed again, this time a string of texts, some from neighbors asking what happened, others from colleagues at the rehab center, hinting at concern over her judgment and her job. There was even a curt message from her boss. We need to talk ASAP. The weight of public opinion pressed down, cold and suffocating. But then another message pinged, a video from Mrs. Taylor. It showed Grace and Eli on the living room floor, surrounded by crayons and paper. Grace's face was tear-stained but determined. Eli looked up at the camera and, with a wobbling voice, said, I'm sorry for running away, Grace. I was scared, but I think Rusty's the bravest cat I ever saw. Grace nodded, her voice a whisper. He saved me. Sarah's throat tightened. For all the outside judgment, inside her little world, there was still room for wonder and gratitude. Maybe that was enough to hold on to for now. Back at home, the neighborhood buzzed with half-truths and speculation. Some neighbors whispered about danger, about whether Sarah was fit to care for Grace, or for Rusty. Others, especially Mrs. Taylor, pushed back with stories of Rusty patrolling the property, of how he'd chased away stray dogs and kept the local wildlife at bay. The town felt suddenly smaller, more scrutinizing, and Sarah realized she'd never really been alone in her choices. She had allies and critics on every side. As the sky began to pale, Sarah's thoughts grew heavy with dread and hope. She longed for the ordinary comfort of home, for Grace's arms around her waist, for the warmth of routine. But she was also afraid that everything she'd built was about to unravel, that Rusty would be taken from them, or worse, that public opinion would demand he be destroyed. She glanced at the recovery room window, the faint hint of dawn edging the world in silver. Inside, Rusty lay curled on his side, bandaged and breathing, but still with a fierce wildness in his eyes. Sarah sat by his side, whispering quiet promises. We'll fight, okay? I won't give up on you. Not ever. Meanwhile, at Sarah's house, Grace lay asleep with Rusty's drawing pressed to her heart. Eli's apology had softened something inside her, helping her release a bit of the guilt she'd been holding. Even in sleep, her brow was furrowed, her small hands clutching the paper as if willing Rusty to come home. The community's tension hung in the air, thick and uncertain. Some parents warned their children not to go near Sarah's house. Others, quietly, told their kids that what Rusty had done was nothing short of heroic. The neighborhood Facebook page was alive with arguments, fearful posts about wild animals, and gratitude from those who remembered when Rusty had helped in ways they hadn't realized until now. Sarah's boss finally called her just after sunrise. I need to know what happened, Sarah. The board is already talking about whether it's safe for you to keep Rusty at your house. You know how this looks. Sarah, voice tired but resolute, explained every detail. She told him about the routine, about the fence, about the rattlesnake and Rusty's quick thinking. If Rusty hadn't been there, Grace could be dead. I know the risks, but I also know what I saw. Her boss sighed. You're going to have to explain this to the board, and probably the whole community. Be ready for a fight, Sarah. But if everything is as you say, maybe there's a chance to change some minds. That morning, as the sun finally rose, Sarah drove home from the clinic, exhausted but determined. Rusty would stay at the vet another night, but Dr. Lopez said his odds were good. Sarah's hope grew with each mile, fueled by the quiet strength of the people who believed in her, and by the unwavering love of a wild animal who'd risked it all. She pulled into the driveway, blinking back tears as Grace raced out to meet her, arms wide and hopeful. Sarah scooped her up, holding her tight, whispering, "He's fighting, just like us." And as the neighborhood watched, some with suspicion, some with silent support, Sarah knew she was ready to face whatever came next. Because courage wasn't just about facing snakes or angry neighbors. Sometimes it was about holding your ground, loving fiercely, and choosing trust, even when the whole world seemed to doubt you. By Monday, the story had spilled out of Sarah's neighborhood and onto every phone and breakfast table in town. The local news headline was impossible to ignore. Wild Bobcat saves girl from deadly rattlesnake. But was it heroism or pure luck? Underneath the photo of Rusty, muzzle visible, eyes wary even from behind the clinic glass, the comments section turned into a battle line. Some praising the brave Bobcat, others demanding he be removed for everyone's safety. By noon, animal control officers had visited Sarah's home twice, their questions sharp and careful, their notepads filling up with every detail. Sarah sat on her front porch, the wood creaking under her weight, watching the news van idle down the street. She felt exposed, every inch of her life up for inspection. Her home, her job, her ability to protect her own daughter. Rusty was still at the vet, recovering, and the yard seemed emptier without him prowling the fence line. Even the wind felt different, as if it carried a warning. She'd already lost count of how many times she'd explained what happened. To animal control, to her boss, to the rehab board, which called a special meeting for that evening, to neighbors who came by just to check in, but left with wary glances and whispered words. Every retelling made Sarah's nerves fray a little more, each question a reminder that trust, whether in a person or an animal, was always a risk. Late that afternoon, Sarah dressed Grace in her favorite yellow dress, the one with the daisy print, and drove her to Mrs. Taylor's. "I have to talk to some grown-ups tonight," Sarah explained, tucking a strand of hair behind Grace's ear. "It's about Rusty. I'll be back before bed." Grace nodded, clutching her superhero drawing. "Tell them Rusty's good, Mom. Tell them he's my hero." Sarah promised she would, even if her own confidence felt paper thin. The community center was already buzzing when she arrived, the parking lot nearly full. Inside, chairs were set in a wide circle, the mood tense and uncertain. Animal control officers sat near the front, their uniforms crisp. Members of the rehab board whispered among themselves, some sympathetic, others wary. They were neighbors, reporters, and even parents Sarah barely knew, their faces stiff with anxiety and suspicion. Her boss, Dr. Caldwell, stood to open the meeting. "We're here to discuss the events at Sarah Miller's home, the safety of the community, and the future of the Bobcat, Rusty." He nodded to Sarah. "Would you start from the beginning?" Sarah stood, her palms sweating, her voice shaking at first. She told the whole story, about Rusty's injury, about how he'd come into their lives after the wildfire, about the strict routines and fences, and most of all, about the moment he pulled Grace away from the snake. She didn't gloss over the fear or the doubts. She was honest about how close it had come, about her own mistakes, But she made one thing clear. Rusty had acted not out of malice, but out of something closer to loyalty. When she finished, the room buzzed with questions. Some were sympathetic. How did Rusty know to protect her? But others cut deeper. What happens next time? What if he snaps? Is it worth the risk to let a wild animal near children? Sarah was ready for those. He's never shown aggression toward anyone. He stays at the edge. Never a pet, always a guardian. I know the line between wild and safe is thin, but sometimes the wild saves us when nothing else will. Just when the tension felt unbearable, a voice rang out from the back. Mrs. Taylor stood, steady and strong. I saw what happened that morning, she declared. Rusty was the only one who saw that snake before it was too late. And I've seen him before, patrolling, chasing off coyotes, keeping our chickens safe. That cat's done more good for this neighborhood than anyone realizes. A ripple of agreement ran through a small group of neighbors. One spoke up, recalling how Rusty had once scared off a pack of stray dogs threatening her own children. Another remembered how, during the worst storm of the year, Rusty slept by Sarah's door, only leaving when the wind died down and all was safe again. Not everyone was convinced, but the tone in the room shifted. The board members exchanged glances. The lead animal control officer stood to address the group. There's no evidence of aggression, only of unusual protective behavior. We'll continue monitoring, but for now, Rusty stays, provided all current safety measures are maintained. Sarah's knees almost buckled in relief. She thanked the board, her neighbors, and especially Mrs. Taylor, tears prickling behind her eyes. The fight wasn't over. There would be more scrutiny, more cautious stares, but for tonight, Rusty was safe. As she left, Mrs. Taylor pressed her hand. Trust is a risk, Sarah, but sometimes it's the only way forward. Don't forget that. Driving home, Sarah thought about what trust really meant. It wasn't blind faith or foolish hope. It was seeing the wild in something or someone and choosing to believe it could be good. That night, as she tucked Grace into bed, Sarah whispered, "Rusty's coming home soon." Grace smiled, eyes shining with sleepy trust. "I knew he would, Mom. I always knew." Outside, the wild night hummed with possibility. Inside, the Miller home brimmed with hope and a little more faith in the line between fear and love. The week that followed was a blur of cautious hope and lingering tension. Rusty's return from the vet was quiet, almost ceremonial. Dr. Lopez brought him home in the battered carrier, and Grace watched from the porch steps with her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles turned white. When Sarah opened the carrier, Rusty stepped out slowly, blinking against the sunlight, his gait stiffer but his eyes still fiercely alive. He sniffed the air, then limped to his usual post at the fence, surveying the land with the same silent vigilance as before. Sarah wasn't sure how the world would respond to Rusty's return, but she knew life wouldn't simply go back to normal. News of the hero Bobcat had spread far beyond their Arizona town. Some folks were supportive, but others kept their distance, eyes sharp with skepticism, waiting for proof that wildness and trust could truly coexist. 2 days after Rusty came home, an unfamiliar SUV parked at the curb. Two people stepped out, a tall, cheerful woman in hiking boots and a man with glasses and a clipboard. They introduced themselves as Dr. Parker and Dr. Chu from Arizona State University's Wildlife Research Program. "We read about your Bobcat," Dr. Parker said, offering Sarah a business card. "We're interested in observing Rusty's behavior, if you'll allow it. Strictly non-invasive, no cages, no stress, just observation." Sarah hesitated. The last thing she wanted was to turn Rusty into a spectacle. But there was a gravity to the researcher's presence, an eagerness that felt different from the gossip and judgment she'd been fighting. "If it means no harm to him and no risk to Grace, I'll consider it," she replied. "But you have to promise. He's not a test subject. He's family." Dr. Parker nodded, her gaze warm but direct. "We understand. We're not here to interfere, just to learn. Rusty's actions are remarkable. Most bobcats in captivity remain unpredictable or detached. His protective instincts are unique." With Sarah's cautious approval, the researchers set up their equipment: motion-activated cameras, notepads, and a handful of behavioral checklists. They observed from a distance, blending into the background of daily life. At first, nothing unusual happened. Rusty slept in the sun, stalked imaginary prey along the fence, and watched Grace with those ancient, unreadable eyes. But then, as if on cue, the world tested those boundaries again. Grace and Eli were playing with blocks near the patio when the neighbor's new dog, a large, excitable Labrador named Scout, bounded over, barking loudly. The kids shrieked in surprise. Before Sarah could move, Rusty rose from his spot, positioning himself smoothly between Grace and the approaching dog. His body language was calm but unmistakably assertive. Ears back, tail straight, gaze locked on Scout. The dog paused, sensing the challenge, then slowly backed away. The tension dissolved as quickly as it had risen. Dr. Chu scribbled notes, voice low and awed. "He's reading the situation, not just reacting. This isn't simple instinct. It's something else." Sarah watched, heart pounding, as Grace ran to Rusty and threw her arms around his neck. Rusty accepted the hug with regal patience, then licked her cheek once, turning back to resume his post. The researchers caught every moment on camera, but Sarah only cared about the way Grace's fear melted away and Eli's eyes widened with new respect. Later that week, Dr. Parker shared her preliminary findings with Sarah over coffee at the kitchen table. "Rusty's behavior is extraordinary. He consistently places himself between Grace and anything unfamiliar. Dogs, delivery people, even us at first. Most rehab bobcats avoid children. But Rusty's loyalty and protectiveness, it's beyond typical animal behavior. It's learned." Sarah frowned, puzzled. "You mean he's different because of us?" "Partly," Dr. Parker said. "He was rescued, socialized, but not tamed. He still keeps his distance from strangers, but with your family, he's attentive, almost like a guardian." "That's rare, Sarah. We'd like to continue observing, with your blessing, and, if you're willing, present Rusty's case at a conference about animal empathy and intelligence." Sarah nodded slowly. "If it helps people understand, and it's safe for Rusty, yes. But he stays here. He's not going anywhere else." As the research continued, small moments added up. During a demonstration for the cameras, Grace accidentally dropped her favorite plush bunny near Scout, the neighbor's dog. Without prompting, Rusty stepped forward, collected the toy in his jaws, and returned it to Grace, never once taking his eyes off the dog. The researchers were amazed. Grace beamed. For her, this was just Rusty being Rusty, a little wild, a little mysterious, but always present. Word began to spread through the community that something remarkable was happening at the Miller house. Eli's parents, once wary, started stopping by with questions instead of accusations. "How did you train him?" they asked, and Sarah would laugh, shaking her head. "I didn't. He just chooses us, over and over." Rusty's reputation as a menace faded. Kids at school talked about the superhero cat with awe. Parents who had once crossed the street to avoid the Millers now lingered at the fence, watching Rusty patrol, exchanging stories about his bravery. One evening, the research team invited local reporters and a handful of neighbors for a demonstration. Grace shyly introduced Rusty to the group, telling the story of how he saved her life. Dr. Chu explained the science. Rusty is living proof that the boundary between wild and domestic isn't as clear as we think. Loyalty, empathy, protection. These aren't just human traits. As twilight settled in and the group applauded, Sarah felt something shift inside her. The fear, the shame, the anxiety of those early days began to dissolve, replaced by something quieter and stronger. Pride. Rusty didn't belong to anyone. Not really. But he had chosen this family, this line between forest and home. In return, they had chosen to trust him, even when the world demanded they draw lines in the sand. And as the moon rose over Prescott National Forest, Rusty sat at the edge of the yard, eyes half closed, tail twitching, a living reminder that sometimes the wildest hearts make the fiercest protectors. With every passing day, the scars of that terrifying morning began to fade, not erased, but woven into the new fabric of life at the Miller home. Rusty's wound healed slowly, the fur on his leg still thin and his gait marked with a permanent limp. But the light in his eyes was undimmed. He reclaimed his favorite spot at the edge of the yard, where wild grass met wire fence, eyes always vigilant, tail flicking as he kept watch over his world. Sarah found herself breathing easier, though the house still echoed with memories of close calls and long nights. She poured her energy into turning that fear into something good. Inspired by the interest from researchers and neighbors alike, she began organizing small gatherings at their home, backyard afternoons where families could meet Rusty, learn about wildlife, and hear firsthand about the blurred line between fear and understanding. The first of these gatherings arrived on a bright Saturday, sunlight dancing through the pines and the air fresh with the promise of new beginnings. Sarah had worried no one would show, but as the clock struck noon, families trickled in, bringing covered dishes, folding chairs, and children full of nervous questions. Grace was the unofficial hostess, her cheeks flushed with excitement. She introduced Rusty to everyone, telling the story of how he had saved her with the fierce pride of a child who knows she is part of something extraordinary. Eli stood by her side, shy at first, but soon swept up in the laughter and chatter. When a classmate asked if he was scared, Eli shook his head. Not anymore. He's the bravest cat I know. Dr. Parker and Dr. Chu from Arizona State were there, answering questions from curious parents, passing out leaflets about wildlife safety and empathy, explaining their research in simple, passionate terms. Every animal is a mystery, Dr. Parker told the group. Sometimes we get to witness something that challenges our ideas about what's possible. Sarah hovered nearby, nerves flaring each time someone edged close to the fence, but Rusty proved himself again and again. He kept his distance from the crowd, circling slowly, occasionally pausing to accept a treat from Grace or Eli, then resuming his silent patrol. The children watched him in awe, whispering about the superhero cat, their eyes wide with wonder. The real surprise came in the afternoon, when Sarah spotted Mark, her ex-husband, standing at the edge of the yard, hands stuffed awkwardly in his jacket pockets. For a moment, Sarah's old defenses flared, but then she saw him watching Grace, his face softening as she knelt to scratch Rusty behind the ears. Mark caught Sarah's gaze and offered a tentative nod. "Mind if I come in?" he called out. Sarah's answer was quiet but firm. "Of course, it's your family too." Mark joined the group, standing just outside the circle, uncertain. But as the afternoon wore on, he watched, listened, and even cracked a smile when Eli recounted Rusty's rescue with wild hand gestures. When Rusty wandered close, Mark tensed, but Grace stepped forward, her voice bright with confidence. It's okay, Daddy. Rusty only gets close if he knows you're safe. For the first time, Mark knelt and offered Rusty his hand, palm up and fingers loose, just as Sarah had taught Grace. Rusty sniffed, hesitated, then accepted the gesture, sitting calmly as Mark petted him once, tentatively, then again with more certainty. The group erupted in cheers and applause, the tension breaking, replaced with laughter and genuine connection. As the sun dipped low, Mrs. Taylor gathered everyone for a story hour, her voice warm and rich. Grace, braver than ever, stood by her side and read aloud the story she'd written. Rusty, the superhero cat. She told how Rusty saved her, how he watched over the neighborhood, and how he was brave even when everyone was afraid. Mrs. Taylor's eyes glistened with tears, and Sarah had to wipe her own face as applause filled the yard. The picnic carried on into twilight, with parents sharing stories of animals from their own childhoods, and children playing tag beneath the whispering pines. Sarah and Mark sat side by side, sharing a rare moment of peace. He's really something, Mark admitted, nodding at Rusty. I still worry, but I see what he means to Grace and to you. Sarah smiled, a weight lifting. Trust is scary, but sometimes it's the only way forward. As the last of the guests left, Eli approached Rusty with a trembling hand, encouraged by Grace's gentle nod. Can I shake your paw? He whispered. Rusty, with the patience of a king, sat down, extended his big, spotted paw, and allowed Eli to wrap his fingers around it. For a second, the yard was silent, everyone watching this small act of courage and acceptance. Then a cheer broke out, and the spell was complete. Rusty was no longer a menace or a rumor. He was a neighbor, a guardian, a legend. That night, as stars blanketed the sky, Sarah tucked Grace into bed, her heart overflowing. The house was still, but the silence was peaceful this time. No fear, just the soft breath of a family rebuilt at the edge of the wild. Grace snuggled under her blanket, clutching her superhero drawing. Mom, she whispered, I think Rusty likes when we're all together. Sarah kissed her forehead, whispering, Me too, baby. Me too. Outside, Rusty perched on the fence, the golden eyes scanning the darkness, a living bridge between two worlds. The wild wasn't gone. It had simply made room for love, for healing, for a new beginning, where anything was possible. The days following that first backyard gathering felt different, quieter but fuller, like a long-held breath finally released. Sarah found herself moving through her routines with a sense of gratitude, aware of the strange, beautiful community that had formed around her family and the wild creature who had changed everything. The fence that once marked the boundary between home and forest now felt less like a wall and more like a bridge, a place where trust and fear, wildness and love could meet without either side losing itself. One Sunday afternoon, Sarah sat on the back porch, her journal open on her knees, the sun warm on her face. Grace and Rusty napped together a few yards away, a tangle of little girl and spotted fur sprawled in the shade. The peaceful scene would have seemed impossible just weeks before. A bobcat and a child, both survivors, both changed by what had happened. Sarah's pen hovered above the page, thoughts swirling as she tried to capture the lessons she'd learned, the questions she still carried. What did it mean, really, to trust the wild? Was the line between animal and human ever truly clear, or was it just a story we told ourselves for comfort? She wrote, Am I braver now, or just luckier? Do I trust Rusty because of what he did, or because I need to believe that wildness isn't the same as danger? Are we responsible for any creature that chooses us, no matter how wild? What do we owe the animals who risk everything for us? Her mind returned to the moment in the yard. The blur of fur, the flash of fangs, Grace's scream. She wondered if there was ever a way to know, with certainty, when trust was earned and when it was a leap into the unknown. Rusty had crossed that border willingly, and in doing so, had forced Sarah to do the same. The impact of Rusty's actions spread further than Sarah ever imagined. Dr. Parker and Dr. Chu, true to their word, had submitted Rusty's case to national wildlife conferences. Researchers from around the country reached out, curious about the bobcat who displayed empathy, loyalty, and complex social behavior more typical of dogs or even humans. A team from a university in California wrote to Sarah, requesting permission to visit and observe Rusty, promising that their research would be strictly observational and respectful. One evening, the local paper ran a follow-up article, not about fear or controversy, but about what Rusty had taught the community. The piece quoted Dr. Parker, "Rusty challenges our assumptions about animal consciousness and empathy. His story encourages us to ask new questions about what animals feel and why they form bonds, not just with each other, but with us." The article ended with a photo. Rusty, perched regally at the fence, Grace's hand resting lightly on his back, both of them looking out into the shimmering woods. Sarah noticed the shift in her neighbors too. Those who once crossed the street now paused to ask about Rusty's health or share their own animal stories. A father who had been Rusty's loudest critic confessed, "My son sleeps with a stuffed bobcat now. I guess fear turns into respect when you see the whole story." Even Eli's parents, who had once demanded Rusty be removed, thanked Sarah for showing us another way. The research into Rusty's behavior made waves in the scientific world, but it was the ordinary, daily moments that meant the most to Sarah. She watched Grace become more confident, no longer afraid to speak up in class, always eager to help at the wildlife center. Her stories full of courage and hope. Mrs. Taylor grew even closer, visiting most afternoons, sometimes bringing cookies, sometimes just sitting in companionable silence as Rusty made his rounds. One afternoon, Grace came home from school with a question. "Mom, are there other animals like Rusty? Ones that would protect a person, even if they're wild?" Sarah thought for a moment. "I think so, honey. Sometimes animals see things we don't. They know when someone needs help, or when it's time to be brave. It's not about being tame. It's about being true to who you are." Grace nodded, satisfied. "I want to help animals when I grow up. Like you, like Rusty." Sarah hugged her close, heart full. "You already do, Gracie. More than you know." In the evenings, after Grace went to bed, Sarah would sit at the window and watch Rusty patrol the edge of the yard. Sometimes he paused, eyes scanning the tree line, ears twitching to catch distant sounds. Other times he came to sit just below the window, staring up as if to say, "I'm still here. I'm still watching." Sarah's reflections deepened as the research was published. The journals called Rusty's case a rare glimpse into the potential for empathy in wild felids, and evidence that interspecies bonds can develop under extraordinary circumstances. The story sparked debate nationwide. Could trust ever be more powerful than fear? Was wildness truly the enemy of love, or its hidden partner? On podcasts and online forums, people argued, shared their own animal tales, and wondered aloud about the mysteries just beyond the fences in their own lives. Sarah finished one journal entry with a single, unshakable thought. Wildness isn't an enemy of love. Sometimes, the bravest thing we can do is trust what we don't fully understand. As summer deepened, Sarah knew life would always hold risks. rattlesnakes and storms, harsh words and tough choices. But she no longer saw those risks as walls. They were thresholds, invitations to meet the world with open eyes and an open heart. The lesson Rusty had given her, and the community, would outlast any headline or research paper. To love bravely, to stand on the border between fear and trust, and to honor the wild, both in the world and within ourselves. And so, as dusk crept in and the first stars blinked awake, Sarah set down her pen and joined Grace and Rusty in the grass, grateful for the strange, beautiful family she'd found at the very edge of the wild. Months slipped quietly by, and the rhythms of life at the Miller home took on a new steadiness, one marked not by fear, but by acceptance, respect, and a deep, unspoken gratitude. Seasons turned, painting the Prescott National Forest in gold, then frost, then spring green once more. Yet some things never changed. Every evening, as dusk crept across the yard, Rusty would emerge from the shadows to take his place at the fence line, his silhouette outlined against the soft Arizona twilight. Grace grew taller, braver, her hair a little longer, her questions more complicated. She started second grade that fall, her reputation as the girl with the superhero cat, a badge she wore with pride. She brought Rusty into every story, every show and tell. Classmates drew him in crayon, some as a wild king, others as a furry angel. Sarah watched her daughter's confidence bloom, her voice stronger, her laughter deeper, a new kindness flickering in her gaze when she saw someone sitting alone. Sarah herself was changed too. The sharp anxiety that had haunted her after the attack softened into a thoughtful vigilance. She still checked the yard's perimeter every morning, still maintained every safety measure, but she did it now with a calm sense of partnership, with Rusty, with Grace, and with the community that had chosen to see the truth behind the headlines. Mrs. Taylor became a near-daily visitor, dropping off baked goods, sometimes just sharing coffee and a silent hour on the porch as the day faded. Even Mark, her ex-husband, had become more present, picking up Grace for weekends, sometimes staying for a quick chat, always asking after Rusty's latest adventures. As the air cooled one October afternoon, Sarah stood at the kitchen window, watching the light shift through the pines. In the yard, Grace and Eli chased each other, their laughter ringing out as bright as birdsong. Rusty, ever the guardian, paced the fence, glancing back at them every so often, his limp less pronounced with each passing week. The scientific world hadn't forgotten them either. Dr. Parker and Dr. Chu's study on Rusty's behavior was published and discussed at national conferences, sparking new research on animal empathy and interspecies bonds. Journalists wrote follow-up pieces, not just about the incident, but about what came after, about healing, understanding, and the new role Rusty had carved out for himself. Sometimes strangers sent letters to the Miller house, thank you notes, drawings, stories of their own brave animals. Sarah kept every one, reading them aloud to Grace in the quiet before bedtime. One chilly evening, as twilight spilled gold across the yard, Sarah called Grace and Eli inside for dinner. 5 more minutes, they pleaded, and she relented, smiling at their boundless energy. She stepped out onto the porch, arms folded, soaking in the sight. Children running, Bobcat watching, the forest standing sentinel behind them all. It struck her suddenly that this tangle of risk and trust, wildness and warmth, was what real courage looked like. After dinner that night, Grace curled up in her mother's lap, her head heavy with sleep. "Mom," she murmured, "will Rusty always stay with us?" Sarah thought about the question, feeling the ache of love and uncertainty. "I hope so, sweetheart. But Rusty's wild at heart. He stays because he chooses to, and we love him enough to let him be who he is. Grace nodded, already drifting off. I love him just like that. The months rolled on. Winter brought storms, sharp and sudden, but Rusty weathered them all, huddling in his favorite shelter until the skies cleared. Spring brought new life, flowers blooming, birds nesting, the world softening at the edges. Each season, the fence remained, not as a cage but as a meeting place, a living bridge between what could never be fully tamed and what could never be fully protected. Sarah found herself reflecting on everything they'd been through, the doubts and fears that had once threatened to swallow her whole. She realized that real courage wasn't about erasing difference or pretending danger didn't exist. It was about meeting the unknown with eyes wide open and a heart willing to risk everything for love. It was about drawing boundaries and then, sometimes, daring to step beyond them. She started sharing their story more openly, at wildlife center talks, at school assemblies, in small community gatherings. Each time she ended with the same message. Trust isn't about certainty, it's about hope. It's about making space for the wildness we don't fully understand, and letting it teach us what love can really be. The world responded. People started seeing their own fences differently, not as barriers, but as invitations to connect, to learn, to find courage in unexpected places. A local teacher started a wildlife club at school. Parents organized field trips to the edge of the forest, where Sarah and Grace welcomed them, always with Rusty keeping watch from a safe, dignified distance. On the anniversary of the day Rusty saved Grace, the neighborhood gathered in the miller's yard. They brought food, stories, and laughter. Children ran wild. Parents lingered long past sunset. Grace stood on a makeshift platform and read a poem she'd written, about courage, about trust, about the wild cat who taught her to be brave. When she finished, the whole yard erupted in applause. As the sun dipped low and the laughter faded into the night, Sarah found herself at the fence line, watching Rusty gaze out into the woods. She joined him, quiet for a long moment, then whispered, "Thank you for trusting us, for showing us how big love can be." Rusty's ears twitched, but he didn't look back. Instead, he sat tall, head high, as Grace and Eli's laughter echoed through the dusk. The wild stretched endlessly before him, and behind him, a home filled with people who had learned, through trial, fear, and hope, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let love be wild. So if you ever find yourself wondering if trust can cross boundaries, remember this. It isn't about making things the same. It's about meeting in that space between, eyes open, heart unguarded, letting the wild in just enough to change you forever. And on the edge of the Prescott woods, as the last light faded, Rusty remained, a living bridge, a promise kept, and a family's guardian, ever watchful, ever wild.